sewer and stormwater bill from the cities.
All right, here we go. Let's kick it off. Good evening and welcome to the March 16th, 2026 study session of your Ashland City Council. Tonight we have two items on the agenda. As you can see, Mayor Graham is not here tonight. She is in Washington, D.C. at the National League of Cities Congressional Cities Conference this week. Sabrina, I believe the first one is the strategic planning update.
Yes, so tonight we have Ashley from our SSW consulting team who's going to go through our strategic plan engagement framework. And they kind of have two asks of us tonight. One is to identify any community events that we may have missed to include on the engagement calendar. And then also if there are events in which you are willing to table or support engagement, we're starting to put together that calendar. So I think they're going to have those two asks at the end of this. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ashley to go through the presentation and then answer some questions at the end if you have any. Ashley, we can't hear you. Could be us.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes?
You're good to go.
Okay, good. I was testing. All right. Sorry about that. Good evening, Mayor, Council. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Ashley Sonoff. I'm part of the SSW consulting team supporting the city in the development of your strategic plan. Tonight, I am sharing with you the engagement framework for the communications and engagement phase of the strategic plan development. I have some slides that I will share with you. Let me share my screen just a moment. All right, can everyone see that?
We can see it. Ashley, can you hear us?
Yes, okay, now I can hear you. Just wanted to make sure before I started. All right. So the communications engagement framework outlines how the city will connect with the community and stakeholders and internally and externally to inform the development of Ashland's strategic plan. Our engagement goals throughout this process, there's three of them. We want to be intentional and inclusive in our engagement opportunities and in the design so that the Ashland community and city staff can bring their voices into the process. This comprehensive engagement will result in a strategic plan that helps people understand and feel connected to a unified vision for the community in Ashland. And we want to build, through this process, build a shared understanding of both the challenges and the opportunities facing the Ashland community and the city organization. And so really here, the goal here is to create a consistent, inclusive engagement process that gathers meaningful input and ensures that the final plan reflects the community priorities and staff expertise. And so also throughout this process, the strategic plan helps to align the work of all of the city departments. And so having input from the community members and across the city is vital to that process. This slide outlines the project timeline for the strategic plan development process. This probably looks familiar to you from the workshop that you did with Sarah and Sasha previously. Just to orient you to where we're at in the different phases of the project. So there's 4 phases, and we are entering into phase 3 of this work. So the strategic plan engagement. This is the phase that includes building the draft communications and engagement plan, preparing project branding and outreach tools, implementing the engagement process, and organizing results into a strategic plan framework for review with project partners and council. And our engagement approach is built around 3 key ideas. We want to meet people where they are already by connecting at existing community events, gatherings, and internal staff meetings. We want to engage a wide range of stakeholders, including residents, businesses, youth, nonprofit partners, community organizations, and internal city staff. And we want to use multiple engagement tools so that participation is accessible and inclusive. And this approach helps ensure that the process reflects a broad cross-section of the community, not just those who typically attend meetings or engage with the city. The city staff and our team have identified a list of potential stakeholders across multiple sectors of the community. Special thanks to counselors who helped share their additions to our stakeholder list. We definitely appreciate your input. As you can see, there's several different groups represented here, and they connect to areas of business and economic life, housing and human services, arts and culture, education and youth, tourism and the event economy, environmental and land use groups, healthcare institutions, community organizations and nonprofits, government partners, civic leadership. And this framework is really also, intentionally calls out non-traditional voices. So such as people who are shift workers or residents who haven't typically engaged with the city in the past. It also includes artists, new residents, so folks that are new to the area, people that are commuting into Ashland for work or school.
And Ashley, if you wouldn't mind, could you just zoom in just a little bit so that we can get that a little more legible for the folks at home? If you can. If you can't, no worries.
I'm not sure if I can zoom in this view, but
okay, no problem.
The slides are available. I believe I shared them with Sabrina and the team, and so we can make those available.
No, we've got them. Thank you very much.
Okay,
no problem.
Sorry about that. All right. The engagement process follows the International Association for Public Participation spectrum of involvement, which clearly defines how the public participates in decision making. And so this approach helps maintain transparency and ensures expectations are clear throughout the process. So depending on the engagement activity that we're doing throughout this process, there's going to be a lot of different engagement tools and events to be able to conduct the engagement. So depending on the activity or the tools being used, we'll use different levels of engagement. So could be informing the community, consulting the community, involving the community, collaborating with partners. And so in the engagement framework, you will see these icons and they'll be associated with all of the various tools. So depending on, like I said, depending on the activity or the tool that we're using, there's different levels of engagement and how we can gather that input.
Ashley, would you like to take questions as you're going along, or would you like to wait till the end? Can we chime in here for just a couple things when you're on a slide?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. Sure. Absolutely.
Councilor Bloom.
Thanks, Councilor. Yeah, hi. Thank you for being here and putting this together. But question about the inform bit. So it talks about providing clear, balanced information to help the public understand issues and decisions. So I'm wondering how we're going to structure that. So when we talk about certain kind of programmings or interests the city has, maybe it's around communities really interested in doing climate change work. How is the community going to understand the trade-offs associated with that? And what I mean by that is as it relates to the budget. We have significant budget challenges, and if we were to pursue some of these interests that the community might have, that might mean having increased fees associated with those. So are you going to be working with city staff to kind of understand the budget related trade-off that comes with some of the issues that maybe the community wants us to take on?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Thank you. And it really depends on, so the way that these different levels of engagement are designed, they're associated with different tools. And so with the Inform, like we'll keep you in the loop, the tools that would typically have that icon or that level of engagement are digital materials, printed materials. They're information and tools that give an overview of the strategic planning process and maybe ways like for members to engage. So it might be a utility bill mailer for people to learn about the project, and then an invitation for them to complete a survey or attend an event. And so at this point in the engagement phase, it's all about gathering information from the community, what their priorities are, what their needs, what their perspectives are, and taking all of that in and doing that through multiple channels and methods and use of different tools. And then a subsequent phase is then having community discussion, and that's where things tie around the budget. So it will get there, but right now the focus is on gathering information from community members.
Excellent. Thanks, Ashley. And one more from Councilor Bloom.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. So I just want to understand the timeline of this. And so to kind of provide an example, we obviously as elected officials, we like to please the community. And so if the community says, hey, I'll use an example that's important to me, we really want to continue the childcare grants. Well, we need to be able to say, okay, well, in order to do that with the budget, we're going to have to do a $2, $3 fee on utilities to pay for that. The community with that information might then come back and say, well, I love childcare, but I don't love it enough to pay $3 a month extra to pay for that. So I'm just wondering where in the process we're going to frame that for the community so that they understand that there are budget realities associated with the issues that they want us to take on.
Yeah, again, that's a really great question. So at this phase of the engagements, it's all focused on kind of taking that first level of first layer of information from the community on their needs, desires, and the things that they would like to see in the future of Ashland. And so once we gather all of that, we'll be able to look at the themes that emerge from that information, and then we'll have subsequent opportunities to engage with the community members where we're almost thinking about it in terms of like pulling back the layers of an onion. So people say they would like to have more parks or some sort of community amenity or some sort of need. Then we have subsequent conversations with the community in terms of, well, what types of parks and where might they be located and what sort of amenities, and really trying to target in on what the desired need or information surrounding those desires so that we can better understand it. And then even later in the process, when you do your budget development, then that's when you can talk about, well, this is how much this would cost and discuss trade-offs and et cetera.
Excellent. Thank you. Mayor Graham?
Yes, thank you. So just so that I understand it, it seems to me in this process, Ashley, that this first step is really about the high level vision of the community. And so since this is going to be a multi-year process, we probably wouldn't see something to that level of detail in the vision statement. And then as we drill down and we decide on activities, that's when we would start to think about these activity categories and start to talk about some of those potential trade-offs. And then the real serious trade-off conversation likely happens when it's at a policy discussion or a budget discussion for council. Am I understanding that correctly in terms of the layering and the tiering of this engagement and what will come out of it?
Yes, yep, that's absolutely correct. It's a good summary. All right, any other questions before we move on?
No, please continue. Thank you.
Right, thank you. This slide contains a list of potential community engagement events. And so one of the key strategies in this framework is engaging at existing community events. So instead of the city putting a bunch of resources into creating a strategic plan event, we can meet community members where they're at and be able to maximize the use of staff resources and other resources that would typically be made to create an event. And so this framework identifies this preliminary list of community events between the months of April and July. And it includes events such as markets, festivals, community gatherings, and local events where where residents are already gathering. And so one thing to note here is that the list of events is preliminary, and this is going to continue to evolve as the engagement process moves forward. And so especially as we gather insights through upcoming one-on-one stakeholder interviews, we might be able to identify additional opportunities for engagement with the community, especially events or opportunities related to youth, schools, and other community groups. I also want to note that this slide is focused on external community engagement and community events, but the complementary internal engagement process is being conducted with city staff, and so that includes a digital survey, department level meetings, and all staff discussions to ensure that staff perspectives inform the process as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Ashley. And just one moment. Councilor Hanson.
Thanks, Chair. Ashley, I'm curious, what do these events look like? Are they staffed by city staff, or do you have a representative there? Are they tables? Some of them are like the Growers Market, First Friday. Some of them might be in other organizations, though. What does it look like?
So that's a really great question. So the first step that we need to take is verify which city staff and council members are available to attend which events. And then we can tailor engagement activities that are going to meet the needs of each event. So whether it's tabling, or maybe there's some sort of fun activation activity, or we're providing coloring sheets for kids while we gather input from busy parents. So everything can be tailored based on the event. But really, what I'll share kind of as your homework that Sabrina mentioned earlier is for us to identify which of the events we have staff available and interested council members to attend, and then we can, again, tailor our approach. And so different events require different engagement approaches, and so we have a bunch of different tools at our disposal. It's something that we love to do. We love to be creative in this space and find fun ways to engage the community. And so once we kind of know, again, where staff can support, where council is interested and available, we can select the most appropriate engagement tools and then start to build those out.
Excellent.
Yeah, and thank you very much. And as a follow-up, are we shooting for a dozen events, or are we shooting for all of these? Are we trying to really get after it and get all of these on the list?
So it's my understanding that the more that you can do, in terms of engagement, the richer data that you're going to receive. And so trying to engage a broad cross-section of your community at different types of events and making sure that you're reaching different demographic groups, so different ages and different cross-sections of the community, that's going to give you the most robust data that we can then pull those engagement themes from. And so then that's going to be that will result in a stronger strategic plan because you'll have received as much input as you can. That being said, we completely recognize that engagement can be time consuming and it's an investment. And so I think we have all of these items here and we'll try to do as many as we can. And it really depends on, the availability of staff and council. And then our team is also willing to support. And so the direction that we've received is that we want to try to do as much as possible, but we want to be really strategic in the events that we do to make sure that we're participating in that broad cross-section of events. So it's not too heavy in one specific demographic area so that we can hear from as many people as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilor Kaplan.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. And my question is actually along similar lines. I think it's super important to do a lot of engagement. And I'm on board with as many tabling events or whatever. But I'm trying to understand a little bit more. What does it look like? What we'll have multiple people doing this, sitting at tables, gathering information. How are we going to? You're going to give us tools. You talked about tools to make sure that we're gathering information that's comparable, so that how we're reporting it out. Could you just give us an example or something so I can visualize it a little bit better? Because otherwise, it seems a bit abstract to me.
Right, yes. Let me get to the next slide because I have some examples that I can show that will help provide some context in terms of what those tools might look like.
Let me just pause you real quick, if you don't mind, Ashley, and we've got 2 more questions. Is it on this slide, Councilor Duquesne, Councilor Bloom? Okay. Councilor Bloom, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Quick one here. I really appreciate this, and I'll start by saying I fully understand that this is preliminary and we're going to build this out. But I think it's important to call out that education and youth is kind of a high priority for us, and I don't see any engagement with or events with SOU and the schools. And so just kind of as a suggestion, because I know we're not trying to set something up, but we're trying to piggyback off other events, would be to reach out to the principals of all of the schools individually, find out when they're having an event where they know that a lot of parents are going to be attending, and see if they would welcome, all of us in to piggyback off of that, because that's going to be probably the single best chance that we have of engaging parents in this community, because I look at these other events and they lean towards a certain demographic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We'll take all of the opportunities to engage with youth as we can, and so that's a really great suggestion to reach out to the principals. So we can do that. Thank you,
Councilor Duquesne.
Thank you, Councilor. Thank you, Chair. My question was pretty much going to piggyback on what was asked before, but looking at this list, is it okay if we add additional groups? Because I can see many groups and many organizations and events that are coming up that are not on this list. And this kind of seems a little redundant, I see, from month to month. And so because we live here and we're involved in the community, I think to have that diverse voice, I would like to be able to add additional groups to this list. Is that fine?
That is more than fine and
Okay.
absolutely welcome. And so part of your homework tonight and coming from this meeting will be to help us identify other opportunities for us to engage, other groups or other events, other individuals in the community that we need to connect with. And so as counselors, you're the eyes and ears and very well connected in your community. And so we welcome any sort of input or suggestions that you have.
So Ashley, how would that work? Would you like counselors and the mayor to funnel things through the city manager or through you, or what's the mechanism to get that information back to you?
So following this meeting, we'll be sharing a stakeholder list with you. Sabrina will be doing that. So all of that communication will go through Sabrina. And you can review our stakeholder list and then check in to see if there's any individuals or groups that we need to add to our list that we may have missed. We've received some input from some counselors already, so thank you for that. So let us know if there's anybody or other groups that we can add. And then you can also have an opportunity to review this list of events. Let us know if there's any events that we may be missing, or ones that, or maybe you don't know what those events are, but you just see a gap in who we're able to reach through these events. Let Sabrina know, and then we'll continue working with staff and then through the stakeholders that we have, that the city has relationships with, including school districts and the like, to be able to continue to explore additional events and opportunities to engage.
Excellent. Thank you. Councilor Duquesne?
Actually, Chair, my question is on the next slide that we haven't got to yet, so
Okay.
I can wait.
Not a problem.
Or I can ask now, whatever you want.
Sure. Why don't you ask now, and then that we can just
Okay,
kinda lead it in.
looking
Thank you.
at, something was asked before, what does that look like? When I looked at the slide previously, before I got here, and I saw, and it has event engagement and social media and things printed out. So are we going to have like common language that will be on these flyers, that will be common questions, so that we are all asking the same thing, or are we just going to wing it?
Another really great question. So no, we won't leave you in the lurch. We're going to provide talking points, consistent messaging, FAQs, all sorts of collateral and content that you can use. We'll package that up in an engagement toolkit for you. And so even at things as specific as language that you can use in social media posts or in emails, or talking points with community members. And that way there's a consistent message that everyone is sharing, and then that helps create an additional focus and clarity around the process, what we're doing, why we're doing it, how people can get involved, how they can share their input.
Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I can share a little bit about this slide. This framework includes a menu of engagement tools. So it includes digital, in-person, and print outreach methods. So some examples, I know there's a lot of different tools on this slide, but some things to highlight are online surveys and project web pages, social media outreach, event tabling, engagement boards. So an engagement board would look like, if you've ever seen like a flip chart on an easel, we'll have boards that we can take to events, and then we have different tools and fun methods for people to be able to share their input, whether they're writing or drawing directly on a board, or they're engaging by voting for something with the dot sticky marker. There's a lot of fun, interesting ways to do engagement boards at events. Other tools are comment cards or idea walls, where someone would take a small, like maybe a 3x5 card, write an idea, and then put it up on a larger wall, and so people can see what other ideas community members have shared. It's really inspirational and it's fun, and then you can move them around to identify like commonalities or themes between that information. Other tools include focus groups, stakeholder interviews. We can also do presentations to community groups. So if there's an existing neighborhood meeting or advisory board meeting, we can come and present to them, invite them to provide their feedback through a variety of ways, whether it's survey or do some sort of engagement at that event. All of these tools are options, and as we determine with like that list of events and different meetings that are available throughout the community over the coming months, our team along with staff can help determine which tools are going to be best suited for each engagement opportunity. And then in addition to community engagement, the city will conduct internal engagement with their staff. And so that's going to be done through a digital survey, department meetings, and all staff meetings. And so this ensures that their strategic plan reflects the expertise and insights of city staff across departments, as well as gathering that broad community input. Other questions on this slide around engagement tools?
Nope, continue.
All right, thank you. All right, so now we're here to homework for council tonight. So following this meeting, your city manager, Sabrina, will share 2 items for council review. The first is the stakeholder list. So we ask that you would please review this spreadsheet and add anyone who we might be missing or who would be important for us to connect with during this process. The second item is a list of the community events on that slide that I shared with you. So please review those events. Let us know if there are any events missing from that list, or again, if you might not know the specific events that are missing, but if you see like if there's a section of the community that we might be missing that's not represented in those events, let us know. We can do we can do additional work to identify opportunities to engage. So let us know what's missing. And then secondly, also very important, let us know which events that you would be interested in attending or supporting with engagement. And once we have a sense of which events you're interested in or where there's support or capacity to attend these events and support with the engagement, then we can narrow in, okay, well, what tools do we need to use? What's that going to look like? And we can provide additional detail.
Excellent. Thank you. Councilor Boone?
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick, appreciate the presentation. Great work so far. I'm really excited to see how this all plays out. But I just wanted a quick point of information for everybody at home or listening on the radio. I know that doesn't exist. If you go to ashlandoregon.gov, agendas and minutes under the government tab, you'll be able to pull up the packet. I know that it was probably a little blurry for some folks at home, and you'll be able to see all that information there. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. Did you have any else or anything else, or is this the concludes this presentation?
Thank you. I think one more item I'd like to highlight is that this engagement framework, it's not static by any means. It's designed to be flexible and iterative throughout this process. So as we begin meeting with stakeholders, having those one-on-one stakeholder interviews, hearing from the community, we expect that this list of events and opportunities could grow and evolve and shift over time. And also, this is not your only time to provide input on what events you would like to attend or events that you know of. And so this is an active living engagement framework because we want the engagement to be really meaningful, and part of that is adjusting and adapting along the way. And also, I will say, something that we do is throughout the engagement, we're collecting data on who we heard from and comparing that to demographic information in the community, and that helps us identify any gaps. So who are we reaching through these tools, through these events, and then who might we not be hearing from that we really need to make sure that we include in this process, and so that way we can adapt and be flexible throughout the process. So I want to make sure that that's known as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Ashley, and I appreciate it. Very good point. And we certainly appreciate your time. And Sabrina, the staff direction in the packet looks like, if I'm reading this correctly, that our homework is the staff direction back to you. Is there anything else that we might be missing, or just follow what we were asked on the slide?
No, so
Previously.
tomorrow I will email council with the stakeholder list as
Okay.
well as a list of events. And so what I need back from you is who's missing from the stakeholder list and where do you want to table?
So that is
And you're
when
gonna be-
where we will provide staff direction to you,
Yeah.
not tonight, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
You don't want to pick the market right now that you
No.
want to? Okay. I guess
Okay.
tomorrow.
Excellent. Thank you. Ashley, did you have anything for us?
No, thank you so much for having us and for your time.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
You too. Take care.
Excellent. All right, now we move on to the wastewater and storm drain cost.
Shocking no one, Scott is here to talk about wastewater and stormwater
Welcome, Scott.
and our lovely consultants. So I'm going to have him walk through this. And tonight, we really just want to know what information are you missing that we can get you before we bring this forward for a vote at a council meeting.
So good evening, I'm Scott Fleury, Public Works Director, and with me tonight is Josiah Close of HDR Engineering, and he is our consultant support team for the cost of service and rate analysis for the wastewater system and the storm drain system. And wastewater includes treatment and collection, and storm drain is just storm drain. As part of this, just a couple quick snippets. In developing these rates and the cost of service, one of the things that has never been implemented is a franchise fee for the storm drain system. So as part of this, we looked at what a franchise fee impact would be from the rate study side of things. Wastewater, water, electric, all the other utilities have a franchise fee imposed on them. Storm drain is a newer fund, developed a couple budget bienniums ago, so it's still a growing, evolving fund as part of city business practice. So in this rate study, we wanted to look at the impacts of that. We also know that the council is having and will be having discussions on policy limits, ending fund balance requirements, reserve requirements. And one of the things that we looked at, especially on the utility side, is, operating costs. We're basically looking at a 90-day limit right now. Is that appropriate? And part of what we will do is take the lead on council on what that policy potentially look like to make alterations. And then the other thing that we're looking at is we have been poor at having kind of a certain set amount sunk into the fund that allows for a little bit of rate stabilization and cost impacts of changing out major equipment over time. The good of it is we did really well years ago when we put a couple $100,000 away annually for about a decade for wastewater that fully funded the membrane replacement projects. So that was built into that structure. So in talking with Josiah and the HDR team and internal staff, one of the things we wanted to do was look at that and start building up an equipment replacement fund to offset potential future significant rate increases associated with major replacement of capital equipment for the storm drain system or for the wastewater treatment plant. And so just a little high-level background. Josiah will get into the details. I'm going to turn it over to him for the presentation, and we'll walk through it. If you have any questions at any time, just stop us on any slide, and we'll answer those questions and truck through the presentation.
So I've got one question actually before you get started for you, Scott, if you don't mind. It might be for Brandon. We can put a pin in it and then maybe answer it later. But you had mentioned the equipment replacement fund, capital, so forth. One of the things that we sometimes get stuck on a little bit is looking at the fund itself and seeing a sometimes rather large balance and thinking that it's just fully unrestricted. Is there a better way, or are there considerations for somehow earmarking things like capital, things like the equipment, so that when either we as policymakers or casual observers or ratepayers are looking through something like OpenGov or the financials, that we can actually see exactly where that money is, for lack of a better term, earmarked for?
So in some of the tables, you'll see that specifically broken down in the study itself. So it shows you, that this much is to be used for debt service for this portion of capital. This rate revenue cash on hand is to be used for this portion of the capital. It doesn't get refined really much past that.
It's just answering the question usually of when, someone looks at it and says, why are we adjusting rates when we have so much potential funds? So,
yeah, and part of that is, the fund balance requirement, the debt service coverage requirements. And one of the things Josiah will talk about is, that arc, and we talked about this with the water rates, is spending down that existing balance down towards those policy limits. Is part of this financial analysis. So in one of the tables, you'll see that trend line head down to kind of the minimum balance requirements established by our debt service and our policy limits. Yeah.
Did you have a question, Councilor Kaplan?
Yeah.
Okay, Councilor Kaplan?
Again, I can think of just a preliminary question before we dive into it, just to frame it all. We've talked a lot about in both cases, the wastewater fund and the storm drain fund, but there are also associated wastewater SDCs and storm drain SDCs. How do this SDC funds, which get it's a different source of revenue for those funds, and can you just tell us, explain for us and for folks listening at home, how that money is allocated for those kinds of capital needs?
So our capital projects defined in the master plans have a system development charge percentage allocation to them. So it can range anywhere from 0% because it provides no additional capacity to 100% because it provides that much more capacity in the system. A lot of them range between 10 and 30% in general, which means that, if it's 10%, 90% has to come from rate revenues. The remaining 10% comes from system development charges that are collected by the planning and building department upon the time of building permit issuance. And so they'll collect wastewater system development charges, transportation system development charges, storm drain system development charges that are all defined by a specific methodology. And we apply that percentage balance that if it's 10%, 10% of the SDC goes to that specific capital project. And that is either cash funded with the other 90%, or that is used to fund debt that is allocated towards that capital project.
So that's already reflected in the capital, because you've got you've spun out a scenario for capital?
Yes.
And
So
go ahead.
he takes capital, we give them the capital numbers, which shows the SDC allotment and the remaining balance required of either debt service or cash funding. So that's all part of the financial package and structure. The other thing that they do as part of the estimating tool is, for materials and services specifically, we look at the out years and percentage increases associated with those. And a lot of that is based on historical performance of what we see from all the materials and services. But we also make some educated guesses on what future of healthcare would be and the impact. And we also have the class and comp study, so we know what the impact of personnel costs is for employees. It's just the real unknown that we've increased from previous rate studies was the healthcare line item. And you can see that in the rate table. You can see all the years, and then over to the side, the percentage increase forecasted for each one of those lines as it grows across the board.
Councilor Duquesne?
It was asked and answered.
Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, let's continue, Josiah, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and good to see you all again. So as Scott mentioned, we're going to talk about wastewater and storm drain. You can roll it forward. So it's a similar process to what we did for water. So overall methodology approaches, but with a different industry manual that we'll get to in a second. You can go forward. So what is pictured there is the WEF, which is Water Environment Federation Manual Practice number 27. If you remember back to water, it does the same thing for wastewater. It outlines the costs that we accumulate, how we go about doing that. When we get to the cost of service component, we're looking at the flow or volume assumptions by customer class, as well as strength assumptions. There isn't an industry manual for storm drain, but what we do is we apply the same approaches from water and wastewater towards the storm drain utilities. As Scott mentioned, this is more of an emerging utility approach that a lot of cities are taking, obviously with weather events being pretty extreme recently too. It's getting a lot of traction, making sure that we're funding these utilities in the same way that we have been funding other utilities. So we'll look at in the rate study, we want to make sure that we have sufficient revenues to cover our operations and maintenance expenses as well as capital. So we want rates set at a level that we are recovering the cost to provide service for the customers. We'll look at other prudent financial planning criteria, which we talked briefly about at the beginning there with debt service coverage ratios, reserves, and level of funding for capital and O&M. So all of those things we'll try to quantify and work into the rates as well as the capital and O&M budgeted expenses. Move forward. So that three-step process, again, the same as water we had last year. The revenue requirement gives us our balance or deficiency of funds when we look at our costs currently and projected into the future versus our current revenue contribution. Then the cost of service looks at the test year or the first year of that period that we're projecting forward, and we look at why we're incurring costs, specifically between different customer classes, and to see if there is any difference in the revenue generation for each of the customer classes. And so we try to align rates to that cost to provide service within the rate design, which is our third step, as well as any policy or structural changes that we want to make within the rate structure. So for the revenue requirement, a little bit more about that. So we look at our budgeted expenses, and then we're going to project forward. As Scott said, there's a line item for each of those expenses. They escalate differently. And so whether it's salaries or benefits, materials and supplies, utility costs, we project those forward. Typically, it's a 2 to 5 year period. We've been going to 10 years for you all just to make sure that we're looking at not only the current rate study period, but into the future to incorporate any capital in that we want to make sure that we're pre-funding for, or making sure that our funding trajectory is going to accomplish that in order to smooth rates over time. We're looking at each individual utility separately so that we're not transferring between utilities, the same approach as in water, so that we can have the best practice of having our wastewater rates pay for our wastewater costs, storm drain costs are covered by storm drain rates. The costs of service, we're looking at then why are we incurring these costs? So again, in wastewater, we're looking at there's a customer component, there's a volume contribution, which varies by customer class, and then a strength component that we look at, or how difficult is it to treat the wastewater flow from each customer class. And that can be different and unique. For example, if you have a restaurant or something like that, it's going to be a little more difficult to treat than a domestic level service. And so we want to incorporate that within the rates that we're charging the customers. We also will then use these proportions and unit costs within our rate design, again, to influence those rates to be set at a level that recovers the cost to provide service for customers. And that's the third step then in the rate design, is including those proportionality unit costs that we get in the cost of service, the overall revenue requirement, so how much revenue do we need to generate to cover our costs, and then the policies that we come up with. Are you all, any prioritizations or schedule changes that we may have? For example, we have in wastewater an alternative structure that we'll look at. And so any of those changes, we combine all three of those and develop the rate schedules then to accomplish all of those goals. Looking at the wastewater utility first. So we started with our current budget, the fiscal year 2026, and then we incorporate our fiscal year 2027 budget, as well as any changes there. We did, as Scott mentioned, there's an equipment reserve that we're starting to fund in 2028 for wastewater. That's $100,000 we're starting out with. And again, that will go into a fund, sometimes called a sinking fund, and where we'll accumulate those reserves to help us pay for capital in the future as it comes up, and to limit that impact to rates. Again, it's a rate stabilization type of mechanism so that we can smooth out the rate transition as much as possible over time. For capital, there's a couple of major projects that we have with the Headworks and the Hardesty site. And so in total, we're looking at around $18.8 million over the next 5-year period within wastewater. And so part of the rate impacts will be just like in water we had, where we need to adjust what our level of capital funding within rates can handle over time. Again, we're projecting forward, so we're trying to meet those capital needs and limit our long-term borrowing as much as possible. There is some issuances that we've assumed, which is prudent from time to time, depending on the type of investment. And again, looking at our debt service coverage ratio to inform us as to how leveraged each utility is, in this case, the wastewater utility. So this is a summary of our capital improvement plan. The first layer of our bar chart cake there is dark gray, the rate funded capital component. That's our pay-as-you-go capital, so the capacity within rates that we have to pay cash for these capital improvements. We're then utilizing reserves in blue. That's the next section. As Scott mentioned, you'll see a chart coming up that shows us using those reserves we have strategically to, again, help minimize the impact to rates. And this is a normal cycle within utilities where you may have larger balances and lower balances. Again, we want to maintain certain minimums and targets, but overall there is cash flow from year to year as projects are identified. Some of them may be larger, and so that timing does use up reserves or build reserves as well. And then the green area is our long-term debt, again, for the Headworks and Hardesty projects to fund those. This is the revenue requirement summary. So this is our accumulation of total costs that we will then compare to our revenue generation for the wastewater utility. Fiscal year 26 is that first column on the far left. You can see the orange shaded area. That is for capital. You see that's below the line because we have more capital than we have available funding. So as we transition rates over time, our goal is to try to meet those capital funding needs as well as our operating. So you'll see the dark gray shaded area is our O&M expenses. That's based on the budgets for 26 and 7, and then we're increasing those at our assumed inflationary metrics so that we can keep pace with how costs are increasing over time. We have the light shaded gray area above that. Yep, go ahead. Yep.
Close, Councilor Sherrill.
Thank you, Chair. Just quickly, what's our anticipated inflation rate? I don't see it anywhere.
So it does vary by different type of.
What are we using for this graph?
Yeah, so each cost within our budget is different for depending on the line item, but in total, it's typically between 3.5% and 4%.
Copy, thanks.
Okay. And then the blue shaded area above the light gray, oh, sorry, I skipped that part. That was the, that is our franchise fee component is the light gray. Oh, did you, just
I was actually going to ask the same thing that Councilor Sherrill
Okay.
asked, so thank you. Continue, please.
The light gray area, that is our franchise related costs. The light blue area above that is from the prior slide, our rate funded capital components, our pay as you go or cash funding for capital. And you can see as we incur debt, those green shaded areas, the blue box has to flex a little bit as we lose some capacity within rates, but then we start to build that in the out years towards 2030 and 31. So as that long-term debt comes in, we don't have the capacity, again, trying to make a smooth transition of rates over time. And the orange shaded area, then we're replenishing our reserves that we used at the beginning of the period. And the dashed line is our targeted rate revenues to cover all of those costs. This was a chart we were mentioning earlier where you can see the dashed line. That is our minimum target of 90 days. Typically, that's a cash flow metric that we want to meet as a minimum when we expend cost to provide service to customers, and then we bill them the following period, and then there's a time delay from when we get those revenues from them paying their bills. And so we want to make sure that we don't fall below that as far as a cash flow for the utility. As we mentioned, there was a couple other questions around reserves. There's a lot of industry manuals out there as far as how you slice up those balances. And so we've had some discussions with staff if we do want to do that further. Typically within a rate model, it's very easy to do. Where we want to be careful is creating a lot more reserves within the city's section. So we may have that within the model, a lot easier to do. And so an example of that is the equipment reserve, where we added that in the model to try to differentiate that specific amount of reserves, whereas previously before that, you could argue that maybe that was within our operating reserve. So again, trying to make a more transparent view of reserves, whether that's a rate stabilization reserve, you can do it 5 to 10% on that. You can do some equipment reserves, contingency reserves. Some people will do a significant asset, like a lift station that's critical for functionality, for example. So there's a lot of targets that we can include within the reserves. But that's all to say, this is us trying to use up those reserves for the wastewater utility, knowing that there is a period here of significant capital investment. And so we're trying to draw down those available operating fund reserves in order to mitigate that impact to our wastewater rates. Mr. Hanson.
Councilor Hanson.
Thank you very much. Josiah, could you break down for me, it might be in the packet, but I couldn't find it, and I'm not recalling from previous conversations. The Headworks and the Hardesty projects have a combined total of 18.8. I see that in the packet. But individually, could you break it down for us between the two?
Yeah, I think Headworks is 7 million and Hardesty. Yeah,
Headworks is 7.4 million. Construction cost, construction administration, right now is what we have is our most recent estimate. And about what we budgeted for in the CIP. Hardesty is broken across streets, storm drain, and wastewater from a development standpoint because they'll all be users of the property. And I think that totalized project was in the neighborhood of $5 million.
Okay, we're up to 12.4 of the 18.8.
And, yeah, and there's all the other projects are within that 18
So we have,
point.
Okay, it's
yeah,
the
there's
umbrella. I was
membrane replacement, clarifier work in the CIP that just weren't specifically called out to get to that total 18 million.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Continue.
So this then summarizes what the impact is for the monthly bill. So this would be the service charge plus the first 400 cubic feet, and that's on a build up to the winter water average. And so that impact is about $2.38 up to $3.11 over the 5-year period that we're showing for wastewater.
And that, just as a reminder, that cubic foot assumption is based on your wintertime demand and does not include any summertime demand because everything that you use internally in winter theoretically heads to the treatment plant through the collection system.
Hold one second. Councilor Bloom.
I was just going to ask, I can't imagine that people's habits change much regarding the toilet between winter and summer, right? I mean, do you actually see an increase? Oh, it's
The irrigation difference in summer.
Yeah,
Landscaping,
okay.
watering along.
So right now.
So why winter instead of summer then, where it's going to be higher?
Because that we don't treat outdoor use. So
Okay.
any sort of outdoor use is not headed to the treatment plant generally.
I see.
Is part of that. And just as a frame of reference, on average, we're producing about 1.75 million gallons a day of water during the winter months. And so theoretically, all of that during the winter months is going to the treatment plant.
Got it.
Yeah.
Councilor Kaplan.
Since you made it, so is that in fact the case? Is that what you're seeing treatment per day at the wastewater treatment plant, about 1.7 million?
It's around that generally. It could be a little bit more when we have rain events because there is some inflow and infiltration that hits the system. So if we have any sort of weather, if we're producing 1.75, sometimes you'll see 2.1. But you also have to realize there's also a timing of the treatment process where potentially you're holding more water and releasing more at the wastewater treatment plant. So there's also a timing impact to the effluent volume that you see.
Councilor Sorrell.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. That's what I was going to state, and I don't want to take over your power as the expert, but it's important to know, and it will go into my argument that's coming, that we need to account for that because the highest processing we have is actually in the winter when we have infiltration from old and failing lines that probably need work. So we get our highest volume of flow then. And then one other thing, just for people that are listening, it's not obvious to a lot of people, but could you maybe just explain how stormwater doesn't go down the sewer and isn't treated that way in most cases in today's standard? Because that's when people are looking at their rates, they're like, why are they raising both? They both go down the same hole, and they don't.
Yeah, so the city of Ashland has two distinct collection systems. And for the wastewater collection system, it only theoretically transports sewer. There are cracks in the pipes. There are leakage points that pick up any sort of groundwater through the system. And that's why you see those spikes, when we have those rain events. And it's within a 24-hour period, you can see that increase. That whole system is regulated by DEQ under our permit. DEQ also regulates the storm drain system under what we call an MS4 permit. And MS4 is a municipally separated storm sewer. And so the storm sewer conveys all of the surface water drainage to essentially the closest water body where it outfalls into Cemetery Creek, Kitchen Creek, Ashland Creek, Bear Creek, throughout the city of Ashland, and is transported, to the Rogue River at that point. And so that has a regulatory obligation under that MS4 permit for us to maintain, inspect the system as part of that as well. So both of these rate structures ensure that we are complying with the regulatory requirements issued by the state and under the Clean Water Act.
Councilor Kaplan, did you have a question? Okay, please.
Yeah, thanks, Scott and Josiah. Those are fabulous pieces of information. I love geeking out on the water and wastewater and stormwater systems. Going back to the rate question, though, I know that the last rate increase was 2020. And here I'm seeing you're kind of going towards a rate increase, starting in 2027, which is July 1st. And then you're talking about 5 years of rate increases. Was the last rate increase a 5-year plan, or was it just a single increase, or what happened there?
So historically, the city has approved 1-year rate increases in May, June, as part of an overall process. Last true rate increases up until recently were 2019, 2022 for the storm drain, which was a 1-year increase as well. When we did the water increases, the council approved both years of the biennium at one time, and I believe you did that as well for electric or something similar. That was something that staff proposed as part of the budget process to approve 2 years worth of rates at one time. I think for this go around, what we would recommend is following the second year of the biennium per the recommended rate increase, and then refreshing the analysis real quick going into the next budget biennium as part of that. Since we will have all the rate tables and the structure, we can internally change some of those numbers to align with our future budget biennium projections, and then make a recommendation at that point for a 2-year rate adoption for the next budget.
So to summarize that, it sounds like what you're going to be expecting to present to us, depending on questions that we may have tonight, is a rate increase for fiscal 2027, and then keep with a projection, which is an idea that there's going to need to be rate increases in the next several years, but we're not actually going to be asked to approve those now. We'll be asked to approve those in each biennium as it goes forward. Is that what you're saying?
That's my intent, correct.
Councilor Duquesne?
Thank you, Chair. Goodness, I know more about wastewater than I ever thought I wanted to know. But I was looking at Resolution 2021-09, and July of 2021, I was just noticing, I looked at it earlier, the storm drain utility went up 9%. And that was in July 2021, correct? Okay, and so looking at that, and I heard mentioned that everything kind of varies depending on restaurant or customer where you are. And in between 2021 and now, we've had a decline in restaurants, and our population has not grown. I don't understand. I was looking at your scales, and then I was also looking at the summary of revenue requirement, and it looks that going down this list here, when I look at the budget and looking at, I believe, 2028, 2029 and onwards, how we get into the red. And the only thing that I can see that has really changed in between 2021 and date is not the number of people, but the number of staff. And I don't think it's sustainable for us to continue to increase rates to maintain staff.
Continue on, and just a quick time check. We're just a little past 6:30, so I know we're asking questions, but continue, please.
So cost of service is our next discussion then on wastewater. Again, we look at each customer class and their specific contribution to flows and strengths. And that's how we're going to look at all of our costs and try to determine what the proportional responsibility is between customer classes. So when we look at each customer class then, and this will come to our alternative rate structure that we wanted to show. Residential, you can see the dark gray, that's the current revenue contribution. And then we take our 2027 total costs, distribute them to the different customer classes, and that's how we get the blue shaded bar next to it. And when you look at multifamily, there is a decrease in that distributed cost versus what their current generation is. Whereas non-residential and residential, we can still see that they do need to increase their proportional share of revenue contribution.
So ideally, those should be even right across all three categories, ideally.
Yeah, and there is definitely a standard deviation, if you will, because of the organization of your chart of accounts from year to year, what costs go up and don't. So plus or minus 5% is typically acceptable. Where we see that difference where it's less, then we do start to ask what's going on there. So yeah.
Fair, thank you.
We also, with staff, wanted to review the tier at 400 cubic feet to make sure that that was prudent. So what we did is looked at our water usage data, which we thankfully had from last year, so that was easy. And we looked at, how many customers are going to be distributed into each of those usage amounts. Because again, what we want to do is charge them appropriately for our estimated wastewater volume contribution. And because we aren't able to meter wastewater volumes or sewer, we need to use water consumption as a surrogate for that. So that's where we come back to a winter water period when most people are not going to be watering outside, and so we can reasonably expect that that will be related to the wastewater flows. So when we looked at that, you can see that gray shaded area, it's very flat across all of those months, and that is at that 0 to 400 cubic feet level. And so we were pretty comfortable with capturing that within the service charge. So for a residential customer, you're not charged for usage in that 0 to 400. It's only when you're using more than that. And so the idea being that there would be, for people with maybe a larger household or a larger contribution to the wastewater system, we're going to charge them for that incremental cost for treating that larger volume.
Councilor Sherrill?
Can you talk about that charge? Because it's, the way I understand it, we're unique to that. And I also understand that it's very hard, it's possible, but hard to meter wastewater. But none of our surrounding comparators do that. Can you talk about why? I mean, I know we've done it, we're not proposing it, we've been doing it, but can you talk about that a little bit so people have a better understanding of why we're unique in that way?
Yeah, so it's definitely, if there's a continuum of, contemporary rate structures, a fixed flat charge is historically what a lot of people have been charging and still do. Utilizing a component with a wastewater, tied to your winter water average is a little more precise, right? Because we're trying to reflect how the customers impact the system. So I would say the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a move away from just a flat fixed charge to including that component. Obviously, geographic areas or communities differ in their wish to go to that because it does obviously bring in some variability within the wastewater bill. We've seen it obviously on the water side and it's accepted. It's just for whatever reason, some communities aren't willing to include that component.
Most. I would push back a little bit and say most.
What's that?
I would push back a little bit and say most communities aren't looking for that.
For the winter water component?
Yeah, like we're really unique. I mean, you're doing your consulting work, you probably get to see a lot of models. Do you have any reason why nobody else in our surrounding areas, including comparators on our charts that we're using? My issue with it really comes on a couple of next slides where we're comparing to everybody else that has a fixed rate when ours is variable. And that doesn't seem like a fair comparison.
Yes, and only if you use over the 400 CF. But yeah,
Right, but if we look at, I mean, I look at lots of utility bills and lots of them are over that. I'd say a majority of them
Yeah.
are over that. And I'd also push back to the 400 number that during the other months, not all that water is going to the treatment plant. A lot of it's going in the yard to meet the demands of the city requirements to have X amount of 1-gallon pots that need to be watered on a drip system and shown on a site plan. Like
Yeah.
it's a bigger picture thing, which I'm not saying is wrong. I'm just wondering why nobody else in our area is doing it.
It could be also water purveyor data, right? That's another consideration. So if you're not the purveyor of water, you may not be able to get the water usage data. And if you are, times when I've worked with people, it's difficult. You get APNs, right? Or like the tax lot, you have to match it with a count. There's privacy concerns if you work with a water district or a mutual company versus city. So there are a lot of things that go into that. Again, this area maybe isn't as prevalent. I do a lot of work in like California areas, and that is much more so prevalent when they do have water data, but that is a big differentiator. And then the chart, the distribution, the Pareto graph on the left. So if we look at up to 400, you're capturing about 50% of customers, 0 to 400. And then even 4 to 6, you're capturing up to about almost 70. So the majority of customers are around that distribution. And so that's where we wanted to look at this. Specifically, staff wanted us to evaluate, is that working or not? A lot of communities too will not include any usage. If they do a wastewater where it's based on the winter water component, they'll do a smaller fixed charge. And so that is a little bit more unique that you include that piece of it. But again, it's to try to help people that may be more sensitive to bill impacts and their water usage to control their bill.
Councilor Kaplan?
Just a point of clarification, when we're talking about this 400 amount, this is not 400 per month during those winter months. This is 400 cubic feet over the course of the winter, of the 4 winter months. Is it January, February, March? That's the 3
Yeah,
months?
we average and it turns into a monthly average.
So it is a
basically.
monthly?
Yeah.
Because I just look at mine and I'm like fraction of that, so.
Continue.
And I'm way over it, so. So what we had was then 2 options for wastewater. We looked at a status quo, so the current structure, just increasing that at our overall system average. And so each component within that was increased based on that. So currently the residential and multifamily have the same service charge as well as their volumetric charge over that 400 cubic feet. A little bit higher on the fixed charge, as well as all usage being billed volumetrically, and that is for all what we considered non-residential. The commercial, governmental, and municipal all have the same rate structure. The alternative was we wanted to consider those results from the cost of service. So when we looked at multifamily, and you think intuitively, 1 unit is probably contributing less wastewater than 1 single family. And so what we came up with was holding the service charge flat for a year and then bringing up residential with commercial in that same year. And so that more aligns with what we're considering their volume contribution. And on average, where residential paying for you're looking at what their potential usage is, and you're capturing that, and then the unit per unit usage over the 400 is being charged. And what we're trying to reflect with multifamily is that typically we'll see on water use data, it's anywhere from 50 to 90% on a per account basis or per unit basis for multifamily. Multifamily being 50 to 80% of the water usage of a single family. So we would expect to see on the wastewater side that they would likely be contributing less wastewater as well. When we look at local utilities to try to compare, one thing to note on Rogue Valley, they obviously have a lot other areas that they serve with a similar rate. So that's why there's a lot of cities that have that same rate within that. And they are lower. They are going through some pretty significant treatment upgrades in the near future as well. Oh, yeah. Did you?
Councilor Sherrill?
Oh, I'll wait until you finish. Sorry, I'm just trying to signal him.
No, just going over it. So there we have in the middle the present City of Ashland rate as well as the proposed under status quo and the alternative. This is at the 400 CF, so there is no volumetric component within it. It's just that service charge. And then you can see within the period that they're maintaining, or within the first year here, excuse me, they're maintaining that kind of middle of the road, what we see.
Thanks for the super clear charts. And like, I'm a huge proponent of supporting water, sewer power. This is the lifeblood of our city. So I don't mean to sound like a critic, even though I'm kind of critical of what I'm seeing, because it just doesn't seem, again, relevant. We have the base rate without any surcharge. We know approximately half of the community is using more than that. And it's missing Medford, which is our biggest local comparison, and it's not even on there. And I'm just wondering if it's because they're $13 or $14 a month. RVSS would incorporate 2 cities, but none of the other cities that are on there. So I'm not saying that this is inaccurate. I think I need like a better explanation of how we figure we're middle in the road if we're pitching the community a raise to their rate when there's some variables that, to me, it's like comparing apples to oranges. And like, I don't mean that like in an attacking way. Just help me understand that more. Back to the point of 3.5% to 4% increase. Like, that's what everything's going up minimum. So I want to wrap my mind around supporting it. But when I'm stopped in the grocery store, which I've already been a couple of times on this just since the agenda came out, I want to be able to explain what the process was of how we got here.
Yep. And we could, another tactic we could use on the comparison would be doing very different volume amounts, if that would help clarify when we maybe look at a low user and a high user to see if this bears out, right, the differences between each of the agencies. And then, if there's a specific one that you're talking about, I didn't catch
City of Medford.
Oh, City of Medford, yeah.
Yeah,
I can answer that right now. It's 3509.
3509? Okay. And we didn't put it on here as a local comparison just because they were too big?
They're not typically a comparator because they don't provide water either.
Well, nor do most of those other comparators.
I think we can add it, but
Okay.
how many comparators would
And
you
I would
like?
always-
That's what we're asking today.
Caution about comparisons, because none of these are going to be an apple-to-apple comparison, because you're talking about gravity versus non-gravity and how much that is in the system. Your customer base in total, the more utility accounts you have, the more you can spread that cost across utility accounts. So these are typically things we show, but I always caution that they're never an apples to apples comparison when we're talking about systems, because every system is unique, whether it be a district or a city run enterprise. So it's just, I think it's a framework to put you in the ballpark of what relative costs are for sewer systems.
Councilor Hanson?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Josiah, the Rogue Valley Sewer Service incurred some big fines from the Environmental Protection Agency because of discharging too much pollution into the Rogue River. And they, according to a little bit of research I did, their rates went up 50% to help cover these infrastructure costs that you're talking about. But it's more than, it's more than just an infrastructure cost fee that's being imposed. It's due to EPA fines. And a lot of the opposition to our own wastewater treatment plant was because it saved money to go down to Rogue Valley Sewer Service, but the ratepayers now of the rest of the valley are dealing with that, and we don't have to. Question is that 50% rate increase that's supposed to hit by July 2025 reflected in this graph?
I'll have to look, and like I said, I know they do have a lot more capital coming up, so I don't think they had so like we're showing out the several years, right? So someone could grab that. And so a lot of agencies don't put out those projections, but we can try to look into seeing if we can find what they're anticipating, into the future.
Yeah, the research I have says 50%. It would be nice to kind of build a model based on that too, because that's important. Thank you.
Continue.
Right, so storm drain, it's the similar assumptions as we had on wastewater, so building off the 26 and 27 budgets. As Scott mentioned, we're incorporating that franchise tax payment that the other utilities currently contribute starting in 2027, so the first year of this. So that is 8% of rate revenues, and that is included. And then as well, the contribution for our equipment reserve starting in 28 at $25,000. Capital, there is some overlap with the Hardesty project. So again, given the size of the storm utility is a much larger impact for them, but we're looking at $3.5 million over this rate setting period, and looking at long-term borrowing minimally for that Hardesty for their component of that project. This is the summary of our capital improvement plan. So again, the rate-funded capital piece is our basis there. We're able to continue to increase that as storm drain has been able to sophisticate their, project planning, and as a newer utility that takes time to identify projects and identify a plan, and obviously the funding needs to be there as well. So we've worked with staff to increase that funding level so that we can not use reserves and long-term debt in the future, and start to rely just on those rate funding components or the capacity within rates to fund our capital improvement program. This is the summary of the total costs for the storm drain utility, our operations and maintenance expenses. You'll see in 27, our light gray taxes and transfers for the storm drain utility starting. And then in 28, our orange, there is our equipment reserve funding starting. And the dashed line is then our total revenue requirement needs that we have, and setting a rates to achieve those. Similar to sewer, we're utilizing our reserves over this period to try to fund those capital projects and offset the rate impacts. Again, maintaining our minimum there, and then also starting the equipment reserve. And as Scott mentioned, and sewer didn't talk to it as much, but the SDCs, we're applying those as they are, as they're able to be applied to the capital projects with the appropriate proportions. So we segregate that use of reserves. We don't touch that just because it is, there is code related to that. So we don't use that, and that is shown in blue for storm here. The impact we're showing is $1 a year for 27, 28, 29, and then that drops down to 75 cents and 50 cents. Again, this is just to show the trajectory of rates, but we wouldn't be asking you to adopt all of these years, similar to wastewater. So within storm drain, we're looking at the equivalent unit that we're charging. And so the basis for yours is 3,000 square feet. And then all the other, the rates that we charge each customer class is based on that equivalent unit. So it's a much more simplified approach where we look at our total costs and our total equivalent units. And then it makes it so that we avoid any of that interclass subsidy or differentiation of service level or revenue generation. So there's no structure changes as part of, what we're showing here for storm. The approach again is pretty contemporary. As far as administrative, there's not a much better approach for storm other than maybe looking at impervious area and calculations by specific parcels and things like that. It requires a lot of GIS data. And so when we talked with staff, we didn't see it was worth going into that detail. This approach is very good for relating the proportionality within each customer class to their assumed contribution. And so we increased each component for all customer classes equally.
Councilor Sorrell?
Thanks, Chair. Question on that, just as we're building out a new model and potentially adding tiers, have we put much thought into keeping up with the state standard when it comes to new laws that are requiring on-site containment for developments with impervious surfaces of 5,000 square feet or more, which that's not just the building roof, right? That could be driveway, patio, the shed of your chicken coop. So we're seeing more and more projects that have to contain their stormwater, and do we have a plan to charge them just the base rate, even though it's not going down the pipe and needing maintenance from the staff, or going into treatment, or taking a route to the creek that we don't maintain? Have we thought about that, and is there a plan to maybe incorporate a rate for situations like that as we see more development?
So our current structure, if you are hydraulically disconnected from the system, you're not charged a storm drain rate. So if you outfall directly to a water body from your property, you are not charged a storm drain rate. Because as you said, you are not impacting the conveyance system and not part of us maintaining it overall. And we know that those regulations have, sharpened a lot, just as our permit has sharpened a lot. They have come from shoulds to shalls with respect to monitoring and maintenance of the storm drain system. So if you're hydraulically disconnected, you shouldn't be charged a storm drain rate because you aren't impacting our system.
Thank you for the clarification on that.
So we did a similar comparison to other, again, not everybody has this even yet within a lot of municipalities. And so, but we did find a few there to compare to, and again, pretty comparable to most people. And we anticipate that, as people do rate studies, they'll likely increase as well. So we wanted to bring these forward to you primarily on the wastewater side with the alternatives, but also any other feedback to then come forward next month with a final recommendation and draft to you all, and then bringing forth the resolutions later in the spring.
Excellent. Thank you, Josiah. Appreciate it. Thank you, Scott. Any questions? Councilor Hanson?
Thanks, Chair. I see reserves, I see contingencies, but what are we planning as a reserve and contingency extra for climate change curveballs? Are we covered, or should we be working towards some sort of additional contingency?
Yeah, and I think on the stormwater side, I know, again, I think that's going to be the staff's working on that, and that's part of this rate study, is giving the funding to address some of those things. I don't know, Scott, if there's particular.
Yeah, so for storm drain, there's design storms that you design to for your system, and that's common accepted methodology. Rogue Valley Sanitary Sewer Services, they developed the design manual and the design requirements for development for storm catchment, retainage, and outflow and management. And those are all design flows that you have to follow as a design engineer and a developer. And those were chosen because if you start to increase the design storm, your piping and your infrastructure gets substantially more expensive, and you enter that kind of law of diminishing returns for managing, a 100-year event. It could happen every year for 100 years, or it could not happen for 1,000 years. So it kind of look at that 25-year design storm threshold as kind of the limits of where you should be in order to manage cost and appropriate infrastructure development. From the wastewater side, we talked about inflow and infiltration, and one of the things that we're doing that the council's approved is called a cured-in-place pipeliner system, where we bid out lining a lot of the smaller sewer lines throughout the city that go under residential properties and things like that that are not easy to access, to help quell some of that inflow that we see in the system. We also do some smoke testing in the system to kind of identify areas where we have leaks. They camera 25% of the system every year, and if they find lines that are damaged or leaking that are easily repairable, they manage that and repair those lines. We also, have a mainline replacement program. They're working on North Main right now. You've probably seen replacing sewer lines. So kind of those are some of the things we're trying to do just to manage volatility in Mother Nature moving forward. And generally, what we're talking about from that standpoint is accounted for in our M&S program and some of the capital that we're working on right now.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Graham?
Thank you, Chair. So a follow-up, Scott, to Councilor Hansen's question. What we're seeing with the projections is that what used to be a 25-year flood is more likely to be a 10-year flood. 50 years may now become our new 25s. And so that's my question, is kind of following up alongside that. I understand what you're saying, but with the expected larger bursts of a similar amounts of water, but in coming down in larger bursts, are there things that we should be doing when we are replacing pipes? So just in the standard course of work, as we do these pipe replacements, should we be, or are we, adjusting for potentially larger flows? So I don't think anyone is suggesting that we should tear up all of the pipes and replace them, planning for that much larger event. But while we're in there, are we making adjustments? I know that that's what some other cities are doing as they expect larger, particularly stormwater events. And then alongside that is, I guess, if that's not the case, how do we account for what's likely to happen as we have more of those systems back up?
So we are, like I said, following the RVSS process and for design flows. All of the developers are following that and what those flow events are for sizing your system. So that's our focus. And I would say until kind of that general policy changes, we would still be following that moving forward. That would be something at a higher policy level that we would have to look at and maybe make some recommended changes to changing the sizing of our system. Partly you have to consider as well that developers are also required to detain storm flow on site as part of those requirements. So the theory is that you're only letting the pre-development runoff get off the property at any one time. And that's how the system is sized. So you could potentially have more from, a larger event, and that's where you deal with a small amount of localized flooding, which is what people have done historically from the infrastructure standpoint. So we could discuss it more in the future, I think, and see where it shakes out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. You other questions? Excellent. Scott, Josiah, thank you so much, as always, for your hard work. And this brings us to the end of the agenda and concludes our study session for tonight. We'll see you all tomorrow night.